The homeless SEAL's dog clawed through a rusted ship wall and exposed the secret that destroyed an entire harbor. Rain hammered the Oregon coast the night former Navy SEAL Jack Mercer spent his last $10 on a rusted fishing trawler nobody wanted. The harbor laughed, until his retired military K9, Shadow, froze below deck and began growling at a steel wall hidden inside the hull. What Jack found behind it would uncover a dead fisherman's final mission, and a secret powerful men had killed to bury for 9 years. Comment 1 if you trust dogs more than people, or 0 if you think Jack should have walked away, and tell us where you're watching from. Rain hammered the Oregon coast with the steady violence of something ancient and unforgiving. The old pickup crawled north along Highway 101 with its headlights cutting weak tunnels through fog and freezing rain. Wind shoved against the rusted frame hard enough to make the steering wheel tremble in Jack Mercer's hands. The truck heater had died 3 states ago. Cold air seeped through the cracked seals around the doors and windows until the inside of the cab felt no warmer than the storm outside. Shadow lay across the passenger seat, with his gray muzzle resting on his paws. The German shepherd's ears twitched at every sound the truck made. Jack understood why. The engine had started knocking an hour earlier. Not loud, just enough. A metallic ticking buried beneath the roar of rain. Jack knew machines the same way some men knew music. Years ago, in another life, he could identify a helicopter problem by vibration alone. Combat did that to a man. You learned to hear danger before you saw it. The truck was dying. He tightened both hands on the steering wheel and stared through the windshield. Pines bent violently along the cliffs above the Pacific. Far below, dark waves smashed themselves against black rocks with white explosions of foam. Beautiful country. Lonely country. The kind of place a man disappeared in. Shadow suddenly lifted his head. Jack glanced at him. "What is it, boy?" The dog stared ahead through the windshield, body tense. Then the engine gave a sharp metallic crack. The truck lurched once, twice, and died. The headlights faded to dim yellow as the pickup rolled onto the gravel shoulder beside a weather-beaten sign that read, "Blackwater Cove, 2 miles." Jack sat motionless while rain rattled across the hood. For a moment, he simply listened. The ticking engine, the storm, his own breathing. That was all. He turned the key once. Nothing. Again. Dead. No click. No grind. No life. Jack leaned back slowly against the torn seat. "Well," he muttered. "That's that." Shadow whined softly. Jack rubbed the dog behind the ears. "You held together longer than I expected." The words were meant for both of them. He opened the glove compartment and counted what remained of his money beneath the weak dome light. A $5 bill, 5 singles, 2 quarters, $10.50. That was everything. 3 years earlier, Jack Mercer had been a Navy SEAL chief with command authority, decorated service records, and men who trusted him with their lives. Now he owned $10 and a dead truck. Funny how fast the world could empty out around a man. The divorce had finished what the war started. Emily lasted 2 years after Afghanistan, before she finally looked at him across their kitchen table and admitted she no longer recognized the person sitting there. Truth was, Jack barely recognized himself either. Too many funerals, too many ghosts, too many nights waking up reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. The military called it PTSD. Jack called it never coming home. He grabbed the old canvas duffel from behind the seat and stepped into the freezing rain. Shadow jumped down beside him, paws splashing into muddy gravel. The dog limped slightly on his back leg. Age was catching him now. White fur had spread across Shadow's muzzle during the last year, but the intelligence in his dark eyes remained sharp as broken glass. Retired military K9. Explosives detection. 7 combat deployments. Shadow had saved Jack's life twice overseas, maybe more. Jack locked the truck out of habit before realizing how ridiculous that was. Nobody was stealing a dead pickup with 200,000 miles and rusted wheel wells. He took one last look at it anyway. That truck had been home for 8 months. Truck stops, rest areas, forest roads, Walmart parking lots, everywhere and nowhere. Now even that was gone. The road curved downhill toward the coast, and through sheets of rain, Jack finally saw the harbor town of Blackwater Cove. The place looked like it was slowly sinking into the Pacific. Old canneries crouched beside dark water like rusted skeletons. Dock lights flickered weakly through fog. Half the storefronts along the main street were boarded up. Fishing boats rocked against piers with peeling paint and tangled nets hanging from their rails. The entire town carried the exhausted silence of something left behind. Jack understood it immediately. He and Shadow walked downhill through the storm while gulls screamed overhead. Nobody looked at them twice. A fisherman smoking beneath an awning glanced at Jack's soaked duffel and kept smoking. An old woman hurried across the street clutching groceries beneath her coat. A neon sign buzzed outside a diner near the waterfront. Martha's Harbor Cafe. Warm yellow light glowed through fogged windows. Jack stopped outside. Shadow sat beside him, dripping rainwater onto the sidewalk. "You hungry?" The dog looked up. "Yeah," Jack said quietly. "Me too." Inside, the diner smelled like coffee, fried onions, and clam chowder. Heat wrapped around Jack the second he stepped through the door. For a moment, he just stood there, absorbing it. The waitress behind the counter looked up from pouring coffee. She was somewhere in her late 60s with silver hair tied back in a loose knot and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Her eyes settled briefly on Jack's soaked boots, the military duffel, Shadow's old tactical collar. Then she simply nodded toward a booth. "Sit wherever you like, sweetheart." No pity, no suspicion, just tired kindness. Jack slid into the booth while Shadow curled beneath the table. He studied the menu carefully. Coffee was $2. Chowder was $6. He could afford one meal if he planned carefully. The waitress appeared beside the booth with 2 steaming mugs, 1 coffee, 1 large bowl of chowder. "And something for your partner there." She set down a plate of chopped roast beef for Shadow. Jack looked up immediately. "I didn't order." "Kitchen made too much," she interrupted calmly. "Would have gone to waste." Jack knew charity when he saw it. Years ago, he would have refused on instinct. Pride. Now he was too tired. "Thank you." She shrugged lightly. "Name's Martha." "Jack." She nodded toward Shadow. "And him?" "Shadow." The old woman smiled faintly. "Military dog?" "Yes, ma'am, Tom." "Figured." She moved away without asking questions. Jack ate slowly while rain battered the diner windows. Shadow finished the roast beef in seconds, then rested his head across Jack's boot. The chowder was hot enough to hurt. Jack welcomed the pain. Outside, the harbor disappeared deeper into fog. A cluster of people moved near the waterfront carrying folding chairs toward one of the piers. Martha followed his gaze. "Harbor auction," she said while refilling his coffee. "Town sells off abandoned equipment every few months." Jack nodded absently. "Any cheap boats?" Martha gave him a curious look. "You looking for work or shelter?" "Either." She studied him a long moment. "There's an old trawler down there nobody wants. Been rotting at Dock 14 nearly a decade." Jack looked back toward the harbor. "Why doesn't anyone want it?" Martha dried a coffee mug slowly. "People around here think the boat's cursed." Jack almost smiled. "Do you?" "No," she paused. "But I think scared people create stories to avoid uncomfortable truths." Jack looked at her more carefully after that. "What happened to the owner?" "Captain Walter Grady disappeared offshore 9 years ago." Martha lowered her voice slightly. "Some folks think he drowned." Others think something uglier happened. Thunder rolled across the harbor outside. Jack finished the last spoonful of chowder. $10, a dead truck, and nowhere to sleep. Maybe cursed boats were still boats. The harbor auction sat beneath a leaking canvas awning near the docks. Rain blew sideways across folding chairs, while a dozen locals huddled in jackets and rubber boots. Nobody looked happy to be there. The auctioneer rushed through items quickly. Broken crab pots, old winches, rusted chain, everything sold cheap. Then came the final listing. The auctioneer cleared his throat while flipping through wet paperwork. Last item tonight, slip 14, former fishing trawler, the Iron Gull, 43-foot steel hull, previous owner Walter Grady, vessel abandoned 9 years ago, sold as is. A strange silence moved through the crowd. Even the rain seemed quieter. Jack followed everyone's gaze toward the far end of the dock. The trawler sat half-hidden in fog beneath weak harbor lights. Rust streaked its hull like dried blood. Windows clouded with salt. Deck sagging slightly beneath years of storms. But the hull was steel, solid, built to survive. Opening bid, the auctioneer sighed. $100. Nothing. 50? Silence. 20. A gull screamed somewhere in darkness. $10, the auctioneer muttered finally. Come on, folks. Scrap metal alone. I'll take it. Every head turned. Jack stood beneath the rain with one hand resting on Shadow's collar. The auctioneer blinked. You serious, son? Jack pulled the damp bills from his pocket. $10. Nobody else spoke. Not one bid. Not one objection. The hammer struck wood. Sold. A heavy man standing near the back suddenly stepped forward through the crowd. Harbor Commissioner Ray Holloway, mid-50s, broad shoulders, weathered face, expensive raincoat. His expression wasn't annoyance. It was fear. Real fear. Jack noticed it immediately. Ray looked from Jack to Shadow, then toward the trawler itself. You bought the Iron Gull? Ray asked carefully. That's usually how auctions work. A few nervous chuckles came from the crowd. Ray ignored them. You planning on staying aboard? For now. Ray's eyes darkened slightly. That boat's unstable. I've lived in worse. Something flickered across Ray Holloway's face then. Not anger. Calculation. The kind Jack remembered from war zones right before violence started. Well, Ray said slowly. Good luck to you. The crowd dispersed quickly afterward, as if nobody wanted to remain near the trawler longer than necessary. Jack took the old brass key from the auctioneer and walked toward Dock 14 through freezing rain. The Iron Gull loomed larger up close. Despite the rust and decay, the vessel still carried a stubborn strength beneath the damage. The steel hull stood thick and heavy against Blackwater. A survivor. Like him. Jack stepped onto the groaning deck. Shadow followed, then abruptly stopped. The dog froze near the stern, every muscle locked tight. Low growls rumbled deep in his throat. Jack turned immediately. Shadow? The German shepherd stared toward the lower hull access hatch near the engine room. Hackles raised, ears forward. Focused. Not frightened. Alert. The same posture he used overseas before hidden explosives were discovered. Jack felt cold crawl slowly up his spine. Rain hammered the deck around them. The harbor lights flickered across Blackwater. And somewhere deep inside the rusted trawler, something answered with a faint metallic thud. Shadow growled harder into the darkness below. The Iron Gull was not empty. Rain pounded the rusted deck while Jack stood motionless beside the hatch leading into the lower engine compartment. Every instinct sharpened instantly inside him. Years of military training slid back into place with terrifying ease. Breathing slowed, eyes scanning, listening. Shadow never reacted without reason. Not overseas. Not now. Jack slowly crouched beside the dog and rested one hand against the thick fur along his neck. "What do you hear?" The German shepherd's ears stayed locked forward. Another metallic sound echoed faintly from below. Clang. Soft. Irregular. Not footsteps. Not movement. Something looser than that. The wind rocked the trawler gently against the dock pilings, and somewhere deep inside the hull, metal shifted again, shun with a hollow groan. Jack exhaled slowly. Old boats made noise, especially during storms. That was all this was. Probably. Still, Shadow remained frozen in place. Jack reached for the hatch handle carefully and pulled upward. Rust squealed. A wave of cold, diesel-smelling air rolled out from below. Darkness stared back at him. Jack grabbed a flashlight hanging beside the hatch entrance and thumbed it on. Weak yellow light cut down into the lower compartment. Pipes, engine housing, steel ribs covered in rust. Nothing else. Shadow gave another low growl. Jack descended the narrow ladder first. The beam of the flashlight moved slowly through the compartment, while rain hammered overhead like distant gunfire. The engine room looked ancient. Salt corrosion coated nearly every surface. Old tools lay scattered near the bulkhead walls. The massive diesel engine crouched in the center like a dead animal half buried in shadow. But Jack immediately noticed something else. The engine itself wasn't destroyed, neglected, abandoned, but not ruined. That surprised him. Most boats left sitting 9 years became floating coffins. The iron Gull still felt stubbornly alive somehow. Jack swept the flashlight deeper into the hull. No animals, no intruders, nothing moving. Behind him, Shadow carefully climbed down the ladder. The dog moved slowly now because of age, favoring his back leg slightly, but his posture remained alert. Then Shadow stopped beside the rear bulkhead. His growl deepened. Jack pointed the flashlight. Only steel wall, nothing more. Yet the dog refused to move away from it. Jack walked closer and knocked his knuckles lightly against the metal plating. Solid. Cold. The sound echoed strangely inside the hull. Shadow pressed his nose near the lower edge of the steel and inhaled deeply. Jack frowned. "What is it, boy?" The dog scratched once at the floor near the wall, then stopped. Jack stared another moment before finally stepping back. "Tomorrow," he muttered. Whatever mystery lived inside this boat could wait until daylight. Right now they needed warmth and sleep, if sleep came at all. They climbed back into the storm while harbor lights shimmered across Blackwater. Wind pushed freezing rain sideways across the docks. Jack unlocked the cabin door and stepped inside the trawler for the first real time. The cabin smelled like salt, mildew, and old wood. But beneath the neglect, the place still carried traces of a life once lived carefully. A coffee mug remained secured beside the tiny sink with a rusted metal hook. Fishing maps curled beneath a cracked compass mounted near the wheelhouse. A faded red flannel jacket still hung beside the door. Walter Grady had vanished 9 years ago, yet the boat still felt occupied by his absence. Jack set down the duffel while Shadow immediately circled the cabin once, inspecting every corner before finally lying near the door. Military habits. Some things never left you. Jack found old blankets sealed inside a storage bench beneath the table. They smelled stale but dry, better than sleeping inside a dead pickup. He managed to get 2 dim cabin lights working after tracing corroded wiring beneath the control panel. The weak yellow glow transformed the darkness slightly. Not home, but shelter. That alone felt dangerous. Jack removed his soaked jacket and sat heavily against the wall beside the small stove. His shoulders ached from cold and exhaustion. Outside, the storm intensified. The Pacific roared beyond the harbor like distant artillery. That sound always pulled memories loose. Afghanistan. Night operations. Rotor blades. Dust storms. Gunfire bouncing between mountain walls. Jack closed his eyes tightly. Not now. Shadow lifted his head immediately, watching him. The dog always knew. Jack rubbed both hands over his face slowly. Just tired. But tired wasn't the problem. The problem was silence. Silence let the ghosts through. Jack rose and examined the stove instead. Old propane line, corroded ignition switch, weak pressure valve, fixable. That word mattered. Fixable meant purpose, and purpose kept men alive. An hour later, the small stove finally ignited with a rough burst of blue flame. Warmth slowly spread through the cabin. Jack sat on the floor beside it while Shadow stretched out nearby. The dog's eyes never fully closed, still guarding, always guarding. You know, Jack said quietly, you could have picked a warmer retirement. Shadow thumped his tail once. Jack smiled faintly despite himself. The smile disappeared quickly. He reached inside the duffel and pulled out a folded photograph worn soft at the edges. Emily. Taken years earlier beside a lake in Virginia. Before the nightmares. Before silence replaced conversation. Before she stopped touching him in his sleep because his reflexes became dangerous. Jack stared at the picture for a long time before putting it away again. Outside, foghorns moaned somewhere beyond the harbor. The sound wrapped around the boat like grief. By midnight, the storm had become violent enough to shake the trawler hard against the dock lines. Jack slept lightly on the narrow bench seat near the stove with Shadow curled beside him. Then the dream came. Desert mountains. Gunfire. Screaming over comms. Blood soaking through gloves. Mason lying motionless in the dirt. Jack trying to stop bleeding that wouldn't stop. Then the explosion. Jack jerked awake violently, with his fist halfway raised, breathing hard, heart hammering. For one terrible second, he didn't know where he was. Shadow stood immediately beside him, pressing firmly against Jack's chest, grounding him, anchoring him. Jack shut his eyes and gripped the dog's collar tightly. "You're okay," he whispered hoarsely. The dog stayed perfectly still until Jack's breathing slowed again. Rain tapped softly now instead of pounding. The storm was finally moving inland. Jack looked around the dim cabin. No desert, no blood, only old wood, salt air, and the steady rocking of the iron Gull. Shadow rested his head against Jack's knee. That simple contact kept him here, present, alive. By morning, the storm had passed. Cold gray sunlight spilled across the harbor through low coastal fog. Fishing boats creaked at their moorings while gulls circled overhead screaming for scraps. Jack stepped onto the deck with a steaming cup of coffee made from grounds he found sealed inside an old cabinet. The harbor looked different in daylight. Smaller. Poorer. Most of the commercial docks were barely functioning. Empty slips stretched across rotting piers where fishing fleets once crowded the water. Blackwater Cove felt like a town slowly starving to death. Jack understood that feeling too. Shadow emerged behind him and immediately trotted toward the stern hatch again. The dog sniffed near the engine compartment entrance before sitting beside it silently. Watching. Waiting. Jack frowned. Still thinking about that? Shadow looked directly at him, then back toward the hatch. Jack leaned against the railing and studied the harbor instead. A few fishermen moved between boats preparing gear. Most glanced briefly toward the iron Gull before quickly looking away again. Not curiosity. Avoidance. That bothered him more than open suspicion would have. Near the end of the dock stood Ray Holloway, speaking with two harbor workers. Even from a distance, Jack could feel the man watching the trawler, watching him. The moment their eyes met, Ray turned away. Interesting. Jack drank his coffee slowly. Then hunger reminded him he hadn't eaten since yesterday. Martha's Harbor Cafe was already busy when he entered later that morning. Fishermen crowded the counter drinking coffee before heading offshore. Conversations dimmed briefly when Jack walked in with Shadow. Not hostile, just cautious. Small towns noticed strangers immediately. Martha spotted him from behind the grill. "Well," she said, "looks like the cursed boat didn't sink overnight." "Not yet." She poured coffee without asking. "How's the dog?" "Better than me." Shadow settled beside the booth, while several older fishermen eyed him carefully. One finally spoke from the counter. "That military shepherd?" Jack nodded once. The fisherman grunted approvingly. "Smartest damn dogs in the world." Another man muttered quietly, "Maybe smart enough to know that boat should stay buried." The diner fell silent for half a second. Martha shot the man a warning look. Jack noticed it immediately. "What's buried?" he asked calmly. Nobody answered. Coffee cups clinked softly. Rainwater dripped from jackets near the entrance. Finally, Martha sighed. "Folks around here talk too much after storms." But Jack caught the unease in her eyes, and he knew something important then. The Iron Gull frightened these people, not because of ghost stories, because of memory. That afternoon, Jack returned to the trawler with a propane canister Martha refused to charge him for basic groceries, an old toolbox purchased for $2 from a dock worker. He spent hours repairing cabin wiring and clearing rusted drainage lines, while Shadow remained strangely focused on the lower hull. The work felt good, simple, direct. Broken things either worked or they didn't. Unlike people. As evening settled over Blackwater Cove, orange harbor lights flickered alive through coastal fog. The smell of salt and diesel drifted across dark water. Jack sat alone in the wheelhouse while Shadow slept nearby. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about where he would sleep tomorrow. That realization scared him more than he expected. Because hope was dangerous. Hope made men careless. Outside, the Iron Gull rocked gently against the dock. Old, wounded, still floating. Just like him. Then Shadow's head suddenly snapped upward. The dog rose instantly and stared toward the engine hatch below deck. Low growls returned. Slow. Warning. Jack stood immediately. A second later, clang. The metallic sound echoed again from somewhere deep inside the hull, this time louder and unmistakably deliberate. Jack stood frozen inside the wheelhouse while Shadow's growl rolled low through the cabin like distant thunder. Clang. The sound came again from somewhere beneath the engine room. Not shifting metal, not waves, a precise impact, as if something heavy had struck steel from inside the hull. Jack moved immediately. Old instincts took over before thought could catch them. He grabbed the flashlight from beside the cabin door and crossed the trawler in 3 silent steps. Shadow was already waiting near the hatch, body tense, ears forward, eyes locked downward. Jack opened the hatch slowly. Cold air drifted upward, carrying the sharp smell of diesel fuel and seawater. Darkness waited below. The flashlight beam cut through shadows as Jack descended the ladder carefully. Every creak of the old boat sounded amplified now. The lower compartment was empty, exactly as before. Rust-stained pipes, ancient engine block, steel ribs arching overhead. Nothing moving. Yet Shadow climbed down behind him and immediately headed toward the rear bulkhead. The same wall, the same section of steel. The dog pressed close and growled harder. Jack approached slowly. The flashlight beam slid across the plating. At first glance, nothing looked unusual. Then he noticed it. The steel around one rectangular section carried slightly different weld marks. Old, nearly invisible beneath corrosion, but different. Jack crouched beside the wall and ran his fingers along the seams. The plate had been installed separately, carefully. Not original construction, a hidden compartment. A cold sensation moved slowly through his chest. Jesus! Shadow scratched once at the lower edge. Jack knocked against the steel with his knuckles. Most of the hull answered with a deep, solid ring, but one section returned a duller sound. Hollow. Something was behind it. Jack leaned back slowly. The iron gull suddenly felt much larger than before, larger and stranger. He swept the flashlight again across the compartment. No tools nearby strong enough to open the plate tonight. And truthfully, he wasn't sure he wanted to. Not yet. Outside, fog rolled thick across the harbor, while the trawler rocked gently against the dock. Jack stood motionless in the dim engine room, listening to the rainwater drip from overhead pipes. Someone had hidden something inside this boat, something important enough to weld into the hull itself. Shadow finally stopped growling. The dog simply stared at the wall as if guarding it. Jack looked at him carefully. "You knew there was something here." Shadow blinked once. Jack almost laughed at himself. Talking to a dog like he could answer. Then again, Shadow had answered plenty of questions over the years without words. Jack climbed back into the cabin and locked the hatch behind them. He slept badly. Dreams came in fragments, floodlights, desert villages, blood on concrete floors, the screaming radio static after explosions. At dawn, he woke sitting upright on the bench with Shadow pressed against his legs. Cold gray light seeped through the wheelhouse windows. The harbor outside looked drowned in fog. Jack rubbed exhaustion from his face and stared toward the engine hatch. The hidden compartment waited below deck like a second heartbeat inside the trawler. He needed tools. Real ones. The harbor supply shed sat near the fuel dock at the far end of the marina. Most of the buildings around it looked abandoned. Salt corrosion covered nearly every surface. Jack found bolt cutters hanging beside the unlocked door. Inside, welding torches, pry bars, old marine repair equipment, crates of rusted fittings. Nobody had touched the place in years. As Jack searched through tools, he became aware of voices outside. Two fishermen stood smoking beside the dock, watching the iron gull through fog. One older, one younger. Their conversation stopped briefly when Jack stepped outside carrying a pry bar and small hammer. The younger man nodded toward the trawler. "You really staying on that thing?" "For now." The older fisherman spat into the water. "Boat should have been scrapped years ago." Jack studied him. "Why wasn't it?" The old man hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Walter Grady wouldn't leave things alone." "Who was he?" The younger fisherman glanced nervously toward the harbor office before answering. "Best captain in Blackwater once." The older man shook his head slowly. "Started asking questions nobody wanted asked." "What kind of questions?" Neither man answered immediately. Finally, the older fisherman muttered, "About missing money, about poisoned fishing grounds, about where certain ships were dumping waste offshore at night." Jack frowned. "And then he disappeared?" The old fisherman looked directly at him. "Storm took him officially." Officially. That word hung there. Before Jack could ask more, both men abruptly fell silent. A black SUV had pulled beside the harbor office. Ray Holloway stepped out. Even at a distance, his presence changed the mood instantly. The younger fisherman dropped his cigarette and walked away without another word. The older man followed. Jack watched Ray for several seconds. The harbor commissioner appeared calm outwardly, but his eyes went immediately toward the iron gull, toward the boat, toward Jack, toward Shadow sitting silently beside the cabin door. Ray walked over slowly. "Morning." Jack nodded once. "Morning." Ray glanced at the pry bar in Jack's hand. Doing repairs? Trying to. Ray looked toward the trawler again. You should be careful investing too much effort into that boat. Jack said nothing. Ray forced a smile. Old vessels can become money pits. Still cheaper than rent. For a moment, neither man moved. Fog drifted across the harbor between them. Finally, Ray spoke again. People around here get attached to stories. Ghost stories. Missing captains. Corruption conspiracies. He shrugged lightly. Small-town boredom. You think Walter Grady imagined things? Ray's eyes narrowed almost invisibly. I think old fishermen drink too much and spend too much time alone. Then he noticed Shadow watching him. The dog hadn't moved once. Not blinking. Not relaxed. Ray shifted uncomfortably. He always stare at people like that? Only the ones he doesn't trust. Silence. Then Ray chuckled softly, though no humor reached his face. Well, welcome to Blackwater Cove. He walked away toward the harbor office without looking back. Shadow watched him the entire time. That afternoon, Jack returned below deck with tools. The lower compartment felt colder now, smaller somehow. Shadow stayed beside the hidden section of hull while Jack examined the welds carefully beneath flashlight glow. Whoever sealed the compartment knew what they were doing. The workmanship was precise, professional. Jack scraped rust away slowly with the pry bar. Fresh steel appeared beneath. Not 9 years old. Older. Maybe decades. Interesting. He worked for nearly an hour before finally stopping. The compartment could wait another day. Something about rushing this felt wrong. Instead, he focused on repairing the bilge pump and cleaning the engine housing. The routine steadied him. Work always had, especially after deployment. You kept moving because stopping meant remembering. By evening, the trawler cabin felt slightly more alive. Jack restored one overhead light completely. He cleared mold from storage lockers. He even found canned soup still sealed inside a galley cabinet. Shadow finally relaxed enough to sleep near the stove while rain tapped gently across the deck above. Around sunset, Martha appeared on the dock carrying a paper bag beneath one arm. Jack stepped outside. You keep feeding me and people will think I'm freeloading. Martha handed him the bag. People already think plenty. Inside were sandwiches, coffee-fresh bandages for Shadow's paw. Jack looked up. He tore a claw scratching at something. I noticed. Martha leaned against the dock railing and studied the iron gull quietly. Walter loved this boat more than anything alive. You knew him well? For 30 years, she smiled faintly. Most mornings he sat in my diner drinking black coffee without speaking 10 words. What happened to him? Martha's expression faded. He got scared near the end. That doesn't sound like a fisherman. No. She looked toward the harbor office lights glowing through fog. It sounded more like a man who discovered dangerous things. Jack thought carefully before speaking. There's something hidden inside this boat. Martha turned sharply toward him. Not surprised. Alarmed. Jack, I found a sealed section in the hull. Then stop looking. The words came instantly, too fast. Jack studied her face. You know what's in there? No. Martha folded her arms tightly against the cold wind. But I know Walter believed somebody wanted him silent. Shadow emerged beside the cabin door and stared toward the harbor again. Martha noticed. That dog reminds me of him. Walter had a shepherd? Old black military dog named Boone. Her eyes softened slightly. Those two were inseparable. Jack felt something tighten in his chest. Another coincidence. Or maybe not. Martha looked back toward the trawler's lower deck. Some things survive storms because they're meant to be found eventually. Then she handed Jack the coffee. Just be careful what wakes up when you start digging. Night settled slowly across Blackwater Cove. Fog swallowed the harbor lights one by one until only scattered reflections shimmered on black water. Jack sat alone in the wheelhouse after midnight while Shadow slept lightly beside the helm. The hidden compartment below seemed to pull at his thoughts constantly now. Questions, secrets, Walter Grady, corruption, fear. Then suddenly, Shadow's head snapped upward again. The dog stood instantly, low growl returning. Jack listened carefully. At first he heard only rain, then footsteps, on the dock outside. Slow, careful, not a fisherman, not drunk wandering, purposeful. Shadow moved silently toward the cabin door. Jack killed the wheelhouse light immediately. Darkness swallowed the trawler. Outside, footsteps stopped beside the iron Gull. Someone was standing on the dock, watching the boat. Watching them. And after a long silence, a flashlight beam swept slowly across the cabin windows. Jack remained perfectly still inside the dark wheelhouse. Shadow stood beside the door without making a sound. The flashlight moved carefully across the glass again. Searching, not random. Someone was checking whether the trawler was occupied. Jack's pulse slowed instead of quickening. Combat had trained him that way. Fear sharpened some men. It paralyzed others. Jack had long ago become the first kind. The beam disappeared. Footsteps creaked softly against the dock outside. Then silence returned. Jack waited another full minute before moving. He eased toward the side window and looked out carefully through a narrow gap in the curtain. Fog drifted across the harbor in pale sheets beneath scattered dock lights. Nobody visible. No movement. But near the harbor office parking lot, a pair of headlights suddenly flickered alive through the mist. Black SUV. The same one Ray Holloway drove. The vehicle pulled away slowly and disappeared into the darkness beyond the marina. Jack stood motionless, watching the empty dock long after the lights vanished. Shadow's growl finally faded. "Yeah," Jack murmured quietly. "I saw him too." The dog stayed alert another several minutes before reluctantly settling near the cabin door again. Jack didn't sleep much after that. The hidden compartment below deck no longer felt like curiosity. It felt dangerous. Morning came wrapped in heavy coastal fog. The harbor bells moaned somewhere beyond visibility, while fishing crews prepared boats for the day's run. Diesel engines coughed awake across the marina one by one. Jack climbed onto the deck, carrying a mug of black coffee. Shadow followed immediately and headed straight toward the engine hatch again. Always the same place, always the same focus. Jack watched the dog carefully. Military working dogs trusted instinct over explanation. They detected changes humans missed. Chemicals, fear, explosives, hidden movement. Shadow believed something mattered beneath that wall. That was enough for Jack now. He spent the morning gathering tools from the abandoned maintenance shed. Portable welding torch, pry bar, marine hammer, bolt cutters, heavy flashlight. Nobody stopped him. Most people around Blackwater Cove seemed determined not to notice the iron Gull at all. Except Ray Holloway. Jack saw the harbor commissioner twice that morning watching the trawler from outside the harbor office windows. Every time Jack looked back, Ray turned away too quickly. That told Jack everything he needed to know. By noon, rain returned. Thin, cold drizzle swept across the docks while gulls circled overhead screaming at fishing boats unloading silver salmon into ice bins. Jack climbed below deck with Shadow beside him. The lower engine compartment smelled of rust, seawater, and old diesel fuel. Weak light from the open hatch barely reached the hidden section of steel plating. Jack set the flashlight on a crate and studied the wall carefully one last time. The weld seams were cleaner here. Deliberate, not factory work. Someone had sealed this compartment shut by hand. He touched the steel lightly, cold as ice. Shadow sat directly beside the wall, watching Jack expectantly. "You really want in there?" The dog's tail moved once against the floor. Jack exhaled slowly and ignited the welding torch. Blue flame hissed through the compartment. The first cut screamed across steel loud enough to vibrate through the hull. Sparks scattered against rusted flooring. The smell of burning metal filled the cramped compartment instantly. Jack worked carefully, methodically, piece by piece. The steel plate was thicker than expected, built to stay hidden. Halfway through the second weld line, he stopped suddenly. Something else caught his attention. Numbers. Tiny scratches near the lower edge of the plate, almost invisible beneath corrosion. Jack wiped grime away with his sleeve. 714. Just 3 numbers carved carefully into the steel, not random. A code. Coordinates maybe, or a combination. Shadow whined softly. "Yeah," Jack muttered. "I see it." Another 30 minutes passed before the final weld finally snapped free with a heavy metallic crack. The steel panel shifted outward slightly. Jack wedged the pry bar into the seam and pulled hard. The hidden compartment groaned open. Cold, stale air drifted out. Shadow immediately stood. Inside sat a dark green waterproof military case roughly the size of a toolbox. Nothing else. No gold, no weapons, no drugs. Just the case. Yet something about it made the entire compartment feel heavier somehow. Jack carefully pulled it free. The case weighed more than expected. Military-grade waterproof seals, steel-reinforced corners, old Navy stencil markings barely visible beneath scratches. Jack stared at it for several seconds before noticing the combination lock on the front. 3 dials. Numbers only. His eyes drifted back toward the carved steel plate. 714. Jack turned the dials carefully. 7, 1, 4. The lock clicked open immediately. Neither Jack nor Shadow moved. Rain drummed softly against the hull overhead. The harbor outside faded into silence. Then Jack slowly lifted the lid. Inside, everything had been preserved with obsessive care. Plastic-wrapped journals, folded nautical maps, old cassette tapes labeled by date, photographs, ledgers, government documents sealed in waterproof sleeves, and on top, one yellow envelope. Written across the front in careful black ink were the words, "To the man the dog chooses." Jack stared at the envelope without breathing. Shadow stepped closer beside him. The old German shepherd sniffed the papers once, then sat quietly beside the case. Calm now, as if he had finally reached what he'd been searching for all along. Jack picked up the envelope slowly. The paper crackled with age. Inside was a handwritten letter. The handwriting was neat but rough, the kind written by a man more used to nets and ropes than pens. Jack began reading. "If you are opening this, then Boone failed to stay alive long enough to guard the truth himself. That means you found this because of a dog. Good. I trusted dogs more than men for most of my life. My name is Walter Grady. If Blackwater Cove still remembers me at all, they remember me as the fisherman who vanished offshore 9 years ago. That story is easier for some people than the truth." Jack glanced briefly at Shadow before continuing. "I was not always a fisherman. Before the harbor, before this boat, before any of it, I served in the United States Navy as a sonar specialist during Vietnam. After the war, I came home carrying ghosts same as every other man who survived things he should not have survived. The ocean was the only place quiet enough to live with them." Jack stopped reading. His chest tightened unexpectedly. The words felt too familiar, too close. He continued slowly. "For 30 years, I watched this harbor feed families, Bury fishermen, survive storms, and hold itself together through honest people doing hard work. Then greed arrived, and greed poisoned everything. The letter detailed illegal dumping operations happening offshore under cover of darkness, chemical waste, missing federal cleanup money, harbor contracts manipulated through shell companies and false repairs. Walter had documented everything, every payment, every meeting, every ship name, every lie. Jack's eyes moved faster now. Near the bottom of the letter, Walter's handwriting became shakier. They know I have evidence. Ray Holloway especially. I confronted him once. That was my mistake. Now men I do not know follow me through the harbor. Someone cut my fuel line last month. Boone alerted me before the engine exploded. If anything happens to me, everything you need is inside this case. The truth. The records. The names. But if you are reading this, understand something first. This harbor is not evil. Most people here are good people surviving hard lives. Do not let hatred poison what still deserves saving. Jack swallowed hard. The final lines were written darker than the rest. A man is measured by what he protects when nobody is watching. The dog will know who you are before you do. Take care of him. And if Blackwater Cove still has any soul left, bring the truth home. Walter Grady. Silence filled the compartment after Jack finished reading. Only the rain remained. Shadow rested beside the case with his tired gray muzzle against the floor. Jack stared at the old papers spread before him. The hidden compartment, the harbor commissioner, the fear in town, the men watching the boat at night. It all connected now. Not ghost stories, not superstition. Someone buried this truth inside the Iron Gull because they were terrified of what would happen if it surfaced. Jack slowly opened one of the journals. Inside were handwritten entries stretching back decades. Fishing logs at first, harbor weather, boat repairs, then slowly, suspicious shipping routes, offshore coordinates, strange night activity, payment records, missing cleanup funds. Walter Grady had spent years documenting corruption quietly while continuing to live among the people involved. And somehow he knew a dog would someday uncover it. Jack leaned back against the engine housing. For the first time since arriving in Blackwater Cove, the trawler no longer felt abandoned. It felt like a mission waiting 9 years for someone to continue it. Above them, thunder rolled faintly over the Pacific. Shadow lifted his head suddenly. Jack heard it too this time. Footsteps. Fast. Coming down the dock toward the Iron Gull. More than one person. Voices carried through rain outside. Then someone shouted from above deck. "Jack!" Martha's voice. Urgent. Fear in it. "Jack, get up here right now." Jack shoved the papers back into the case instantly. Shadow was already moving toward the ladder. The old trawler groaned beneath heavy footsteps outside. And somewhere beyond the harbor fog, sirens began wailing. The sound rolled across Blackwater Cove like a warning carried by the sea itself. Jack slammed the military case shut and grabbed it instantly. "Shadow!" The German shepherd was already climbing the ladder ahead of him. Jack followed fast, emerging into freezing rain just as Martha rushed onto the deck of the Iron Gull. Her silver hair was soaked against her coat, breathing hard from hurrying down the docks. "You need to hide whatever you found," she said immediately. Jack froze. "How do you know I found something?" Martha glanced nervously toward the harbor entrance where flashing red emergency lights glowed faintly through fog. "Because Ray Holloway just called the sheriff's office claiming somebody broke into harbor property." Her eyes moved toward the engine hatch behind Jack. "And because men don't panic unless they're afraid." Jack tightened his grip on the case. 2 sheriff vehicles rolled slowly into the marina parking lot through sheets of rain. Harbor workers had already gathered near the office under umbrellas, whispering among themselves. Shadow stepped protectively beside Jack, ears forward. Martha lowered her voice. Listen carefully to me. Don't let Ray know how much you found. Jack studied her carefully. You knew Walter was hiding something. I suspected. Martha looked out toward the water. Walter changed near the end. He stopped sleeping, started watching the harbor at night, like he was waiting for something terrible to happen. And Ray? Martha's face hardened slightly. Ray used to be different. Jack noticed she said it with disappointment instead of hatred. That mattered. Before he could ask more, heavy footsteps approached across the dock. Sheriff Dean Coulter climbed onto the trawler beneath a dripping raincoat. Late 60s, thick beard, tired eyes. Not the kind of man eager for conflict. Ray Holloway followed closely behind him. The harbor commissioner's gaze immediately locked onto the case in Jack's hand. Only for a second. But Jack saw it. Fear again. Real fear. Sheriff Coulter removed his hat politely. Morning. Jack nodded once. Sheriff? Ray forced a smile that looked painful. Sorry for the disturbance. Harbor security reported unauthorized entry into the maintenance shed. Jack said nothing. Coulter glanced around the trawler. You take anything from the shed, son? Some repair tools. That shed belongs to the harbor. Jack gestured toward the rotting deck beneath them. So does this boat now. Ray's jaw tightened. The Iron Gull may legally belong to you, he said carefully, but the harbor infrastructure does not. Jack stared at him evenly. Then bill me for the pry bar. The sheriff hid a faint smile beneath his beard. Ray did not. His eyes drifted again toward the case. What's in there? Jack answered without hesitation. Old papers. Rain rattled softly against the wheelhouse windows. Nobody moved. Then Shadow stepped forward slightly. Not aggressive, but enough. The old military shepherd positioned himself directly between Ray Holloway and Jack, watching him. Ray instinctively stopped advancing. Sheriff Coulter noticed that too. Finally, the sheriff sighed. Return the tools when you're done with them. He looked toward Ray. That enough to satisfy everybody? Ray forced another smile. For now. But before leaving the boat, he looked directly at Jack. Some things in this town are better left buried. Then he turned and walked back into the rain. Sheriff Coulter lingered a moment longer. Quietly, he said, Walter Grady was my friend. Jack looked up sharply. The sheriff nodded once toward the case. Be careful who sees what's in there. Then he followed Ray off the trawler. Fog swallowed both men quickly. The harbor grew quiet again, except for rain and gull cries. Martha exhaled slowly. He knows. Ray? He knows Walter left evidence somewhere. She looked toward the engine compartment hatch. And now he knows you found it. Jack carried the case inside immediately. Shadow followed close beside him. The cabin suddenly felt smaller than before, more exposed. Jack locked the door, pulled curtains shut, and laid the military case carefully across the table beneath weak yellow cabin lights. The rain outside softened into mist. For several seconds, he simply stared at the journals inside. Then slowly, he opened the first one. Walter Grady's handwriting filled the pages in neat block letters. The early entries were ordinary. Fishing conditions, repairs, weather, expenses, a man recording a simple life. But gradually, something else emerged. Names, families, quiet acts of kindness hidden between daily routines. January 14th, paid fuel bill for Tommy Reeves after his engine failure. Told dock office to say it came from emergency relief fund. March 3rd, dropped groceries on the Keller porch after dark. Pride matters to men who work hard. July 11th, covered hospital costs for Martha Quinn's husband after the heart attack. She must never know it came from me. Jack looked up slowly. Martha had no idea. The journal continued. Walter had secretly paid. Mortgages, medical bills, funeral costs, fishing debts, heating expenses during harsh winters. Over and over, year after year, quietly, without taking credit. Jack turned pages more slowly now. Something about the entries felt painfully familiar. The instinct to carry burdens alone, to protect people without needing recognition, to suffer quietly because it seemed easier than asking for help. Shadow lay beside the table, resting his head near the journals. Calm now, almost peaceful. Jack opened another entry. October 9th, people think strength means surviving alone. They are wrong. Real strength is carrying others when nobody sees it happening. Jack stopped reading. The words hit harder than expected. Outside, harbor bells echoed faintly through fog. Jack rubbed tired hands across his face. He understood Walter Grady now. Not fully, but enough. The old fisherman had returned from war carrying invisible damage just like him, and somehow he turned that pain outward into kindness instead of isolation. Jack leaned back slowly. What happened to you, old man? The next journals darkened. The tone shifted. Walter began documenting strange shipping activity offshore. Late-night cargo transfers, chemical odors near restricted coves, dead fish washing ashore, missing federal cleanup money. And always, Ray Holloway's name appearing somewhere nearby. Jack spread maps across the table carefully. Offshore coordinates had been marked repeatedly in red ink. Specific routes, specific nights, specific ships. Walter had built a case, a serious one, and he'd done it alone. Shadow suddenly lifted his head. Jack listened. Footsteps again outside, but slower this time. Careful, not threatening. A soft knock followed against the cabin door. Jack rose cautiously and opened it halfway. Sheriff Coulter stood outside alone beneath gray drizzle. I figured Ray wouldn't leave you much breathing room, the sheriff said quietly. Jack stepped aside. Coulter entered the cabin slowly and immediately noticed the journals spread across the table. His weathered face tightened with emotion. Lord, he whispered. He picked up one carefully, read silently for several moments, then sat heavily across from Jack. He really kept all this. You knew he was investigating something? Coulter nodded faintly. Walter came to me once. Said harbor funds were disappearing. Said toxic dumping was poisoning fishing grounds. He looked down at the journal. I told him to bring proof. Jack studied him carefully. He did. Yes. Coulter swallowed hard. And 2 weeks later, he vanished. Rain tapped gently across the windows. The sheriff looked older suddenly, smaller somehow. I should have listened harder. Jack remained quiet, because he understood guilt too well to interrupt another man carrying it. Coulter pointed toward the journals. Most people in Blackwater Cove thought Walter was just another lonely fisherman. A faint smile crossed his face. Truth is, half this harbor survived because of him. Jack thought about Martha, about groceries left anonymously, about hospital bills, about all the ways invisible people held broken communities together without anybody noticing. The sheriff looked toward Shadow. Walter had a shepherd named Boone, smartest dog I ever saw. His eyes narrowed slightly. Shadow reminds me of him. Jack nodded. Martha said the same thing. Coulter stood slowly. If Ray realizes how much evidence is in here, he'll panic. He looked directly at Jack. Men like him become dangerous when they're cornered. Jack's expression hardened slightly. So do men like me. For the first time, Sheriff Coulter smiled. A real smile. Yeah, he said quietly. "That's exactly what worries me." After he left, darkness settled slowly across Blackwater Cove. Fog thickened again around the harbor. Jack lit the small stove and continued reading Walter's journals deep into the night. Page after page revealed the same truth. Walter Grady had spent 30 years protecting people who never even knew his name mattered. And somewhere along the way, he discovered corruption large enough to get him killed. Near midnight, Jack finally opened a smaller envelope hidden beneath the maps. Inside was a photograph. Old, faded. Walter Grady stood beside a younger German shepherd, wearing an old military working harness. Boone. The resemblance to Shadow was uncanny. Same eyes, same posture, same unwavering loyalty. On the back of the photo, Walter had written, "Dogs know the truth about men long before the world does." Jack stared at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked down at Shadow sleeping beside the stove. The old dog lifted one ear slightly without opening his eyes. Jack smiled faintly despite himself. "You picked this mission too, didn't you?" Outside, the Pacific storm finally broke apart. Moonlight spilled faintly through thinning fog across the harbor waters. But somewhere beyond the marina, inside the dark windows of the harbor office, Ray Holloway stood watching the lights inside the Iron Gull, and for the first time in 9 years, he looked afraid. Ray Holloway stood motionless behind the dark harbor office window, while fog drifted across the marina outside. The lights inside the Iron Gull still glowed faintly through the mist. Walter Grady's boat. Walter Grady's secrets. Back from the dead. Ray slowly closed the office blinds. But even after the glass disappeared behind gray fabric, the fear remained on his face. Because fear had started this entire thing years ago, and now it was returning. Out on the trawler, Jack sat alone at the cabin table with Walter's journals spread beneath weak yellow light. Shadow slept near the stove, though not deeply. The old shepherd's ears still twitched at every sound from the harbor outside. Jack read until nearly dawn. The deeper he went into Walter's writings, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't simple theft. Walter had uncovered something much larger. Certain cargo ships entering Blackwater Cove under cover of storms weren't listed in official harbor records. Walter documented barrels unloaded at night onto restricted barges before disappearing offshore toward protected fishing waters. Toxic dumping, illegal disposal, federal cleanup grants arriving afterward, then vanishing. Jack flipped through pages filled with dates, signatures, fuel receipts, photographs, and shipping coordinates. Walter had spent years building evidence carefully, quietly, alone. And somewhere along the way, people noticed. By morning, the cabin air smelled of burnt coffee and old paper. Jack rubbed exhaustion from his eyes and looked toward Shadow. "You know what the problem is, buddy?" The dog lifted his head slightly. "He was a better man than me." Shadow thumped his tail once against the floorboards. Jack almost smiled. Outside, rain had stopped completely. Cold, pale sunlight spread across the harbor for the first time in days. Fishing boats moved slowly through the marina entrance toward open water, while gulls wheeled overhead screaming at the morning tide. Blackwater Cove looked almost peaceful in daylight. But Jack had spent enough years in war zones to know peaceful places often hid ugly things underneath. He stepped outside with a cup of coffee. The harbor immediately felt different. People were watching him now. Not openly, but enough. 2 dock workers stopped talking when he passed. A mechanic near the fuel station stared too long before looking away. Even the fisherman unloading salmon seemed tense whenever the Iron Gull entered view. Word had spread. Jack and Shadow had opened something people wanted closed. Martha appeared from the diner carrying a paper sack under one arm. "Breakfast." You're gonna ruin your reputation feeding strays. She handed him the bag. Town already thinks I'm stubborn. Inside were eggs, biscuits, thick slices of bacon wrapped separately for Shadow. The dog perked up immediately at the smell. Martha smiled faintly. He's getting spoiled. He earned it. Her expression softened watching Shadow limp slightly across the deck. He's old. So am I. You're not old, Jack. She studied him carefully. You're tired. That landed harder than he expected. Jack leaned against the rail looking out across the water. Martha, how much did Walter tell people before he vanished? Very little. She folded her arms against the cold wind. Walter believed proof mattered more than accusations. He trusted the wrong people. Yes, she paused. And no. Jack looked at her. Walter trusted people individually. He just stopped trusting systems. That sounded familiar too. Too familiar. Martha glanced toward the harbor office. You need to understand something about Ray Holloway. Her voice lowered. This town used to love him. Jack frowned. He doesn't seem lovable. He wasn't always like this. Martha watched fishermen hauling nets along the docks. Years ago, Ray fought hard for Blackwater Cove. Federal grants, harbor repairs, new contracts. People thought he was saving the town. And now? Now people avoid talking about him altogether. Jack knew that pattern. Power changed men slowly, almost invisibly, like rust beneath paint. Before he could answer, Shadow suddenly stiffened beside the railing. The dog's ears snapped toward the far end of the dock. Jack followed his gaze. Two men stood near the fuel station pretending to work on crab pots, both watching the trawler, both looking away too quickly whenever Jack glanced over. One wore a gray hooded sweatshirt despite the clear weather. The other had prison tattoos climbing both hands. Neither looked like fishermen. Martha noticed them too. Her face tightened immediately. They've been around since dawn. Friends of Ray's? Ray doesn't have friends anymore. She looked at Jack carefully. Just men who owe him things. The tattooed man suddenly pointed subtly toward the iron gull. The hooded man nodded. Then both walked away toward the parking lot. Shadow growled low. Jack's entire posture changed instantly. Combat awareness sliding back into place again. He hated how natural it still felt. Martha saw it happen too. Saw the marine hard stillness settle behind his eyes. Jack, I'm fine. No, she said quietly. You're preparing. That word hung between them. Because she was right. Later that afternoon, Jack discovered the first sabotage. He climbed below deck planning to test the engine fuel system. Instead, he found diesel pooled beneath the engine housing. Fresh leak. Cut line. Not accidental. Jack crouched beside the damaged hose in silence. Clean knife slice. Professional. Someone wanted the trawler disabled. Or worse. Shadow stood near the compartment entrance, growling softly again. Jack reached automatically for tools. The repair itself only took 20 minutes, but the message behind it lingered. We know where you live now. As evening settled over Blackwater Cove, fog returned from the Pacific in thick silver walls. Harbor lights flickered alive one by one across the marina. Jack kept reading Walter's journals. One entry stopped him cold. November 18th, Boone alerted on Ray's truck tonight. Strong chemical scent from cargo containers heading offshore. I followed the barge route 2 miles north before lights disappeared near Devil's Reef. Another. January 4th. They offered me money today. More than I've ever seen. I told them no. Ray looked scared after that. Scared men become dangerous. Jack leaned back slowly. The cabin creaked gently around him, while the ocean breathed against the hull outside. Walter Grady knew he was being hunted, and still he kept collecting evidence. Shadow suddenly barked sharply. One bark. Alert. Jack moved instantly toward the deck. Footsteps hammered across the dock outside. Fast. Running. Then, crash! The cabin door exploded inward violently. A man in a hooded sweatshirt stumbled through holding a metal pipe. Shadow hit him before Jack could move. The German shepherd launched forward with terrifying speed despite his age. The intruder screamed as Shadow slammed him backward against the table. A second man appeared behind him, holding a flashlight and knife. Jack reacted automatically. Years of SEAL training erased hesitation completely. He drove the second man into the cabin wall hard enough to knock the knife away. The flashlight shattered across the floor. The first intruder tried swinging the pipe wildly. Shadow locked onto his forearm instantly. The man screamed again. Jack grabbed him by the collar and shoved him toward the door. "Get off my boat!" The intruder stumbled backward onto the rain-slicked deck. The second man scrambled after him, clutching his ribs. Both disappeared into fog, running down the dock. Then Jack heard it. A sharp, painful yelp behind him. Shadow limped heavily near the overturned table. Blood dripped onto the floorboards. Jack dropped beside him immediately. "Shadow!" The dog's front shoulder had been cut during the struggle. Not deep, but enough. Jack's chest tightened painfully. The old shepherd tried standing straighter despite the injury. Still guarding. Still ready. Jack pressed cloth against the wound carefully, while Shadow leaned against him, breathing hard. "It's okay," Jack murmured softly. "You did good." The dog rested his muzzle briefly against Jack's chest. For several seconds, neither moved. Only the storm outside. Only the sound of the harbor. Only two old soldiers holding each other together in the dim cabin light. Jack cleaned and bandaged the wound carefully, using old field medical habits he hoped he'd never need again. Shadow never complained once, not even when it hurt. Later, after the cabin was secured again, Jack sat beside the stove with Walter's photograph in his hands. Walter standing beside Boone. Now Shadow bleeding beside the same hidden truth years later. The similarities were becoming impossible to ignore. Jack turned the photo over again. On the back, Walter had written another line beneath the first one. "If the dog trusts you, finish what I started." Jack stared at those words for a long time. Outside, fog swallowed the harbor completely, and somewhere beyond the darkness, a truck engine idled quietly near the marina entrance, watching the iron gull. Waiting. The truck engine idled somewhere beyond the harbor fog for nearly 20 minutes before finally disappearing into the night. Jack never relaxed once. He sat awake beside the stove with Walter Grady's journals spread across the table and Shadow sleeping beside his boots, one paw bandaged carefully beneath an old towel. The dog twitched occasionally in his sleep. Dreaming. Jack understood that too. Outside, the Pacific breathed against the docks in slow, dark swells while fog wrapped the harbor in silence thick enough to feel alive. The iron gull creaked softly around them. Old wood, old steel, old ghosts. And somewhere inside Jack Mercer, something dangerous had begun waking up again. Not violence, purpose. That scared him more. He finally slept near dawn. Only 2 hours, but enough to dream again. Afghanistan returned exactly the way it always did. Heat, dust, the smell of burning rubber and blood. Jack running through shattered concrete walls while gunfire cracked overhead. Mason screaming for help somewhere behind smoke. Then silence. Always silence after. Jack jerked awake hard enough to knock over the coffee cup beside him. Shadow was already there immediately, muzzle pressed firmly against Jack's chest, grounding him, holding him in the present. Jack shut his eyes tightly and gripped the dog's collar. "I'm here," he whispered hoarsely. The old shepherd stayed against him until the shaking stopped. Morning light slowly filtered through the fogged cabin windows. Gray. Cold. Peaceful. The kind of peaceful that only exists after storms survive the night. Jack rubbed tired hands over his face and looked around the small cabin. Walter's journals, the maps, the evidence, the hidden compartment now sitting open beneath the engine room, the broken door from last night's attack. Every sign pointed the same direction now. Things were escalating, and people got hurt when escalation continued. Shadow limped slightly when he stood. That alone settled something heavily inside Jack's chest. He had lost enough already. By mid-morning, Blackwater Cove moved through another cold harbor day beneath low-hanging clouds. Fishing crews unloaded silver salmon across slick wooden docks, while gulls screamed overhead, fighting for scraps. Life continued, as if corruption and fear existed quietly underneath ordinary routines. Jack repaired the cabin door first, then reinforced the locks, then installed fishing hooks and wire bells near the stern entrance the same way SEAL teams rigged primitive alert systems overseas. Old habits. Old survival instincts. Shadow watched him carefully from the deck. The dog seemed slower after the injury, but his eyes remained sharp, always watching. Around noon, Martha arrived carrying coffee and sandwiches again. She stopped immediately when she saw the repaired doorframe. Dear God. Jack handed her the bent metal pipe left behind by the intruders. They came looking for the journals. Martha's face went pale. You told somebody? No. Then Ray guessed. Jack leaned against the railing, looking toward the harbor office. Ray doesn't seem like the guessing type anymore. Martha stood quietly beside him, watching fishermen work across the docks. Finally, she spoke. You know what the saddest thing about this town is? Jack glanced at her. Most people here already suspect something's wrong. Her eyes stayed on the harbor. They just learned survival sometimes means pretending not to see it. Jack understood that too well. He spent years pretending he was fine after the war, because everyone around him seemed more comfortable that way. Martha handed him the coffee. You look exhausted. Didn't sleep much. You ever think maybe you deserve better than survival? Jack almost laughed. That ship sailed a long time ago. No. Martha shook her head softly. You just stopped boarding it. The words stayed with him long after she returned to the diner. That afternoon, rain finally broke apart completely. For the first time since arriving in Blackwater Cove, sunlight pushed through the clouds in pale silver beams across the harbor water. Jack sat inside the wheelhouse reading another of Walter's journals while Shadow slept nearby. One entry stopped him cold. February 2nd. Boone is slowing down now. Arthritis in his hips, gray around the muzzle, but he still watches the docks every night like he believes protecting things matters even when nobody notices anymore. Jack looked down at Shadow instinctively. The old shepherd slept with one ear twitching lightly. Walter's next sentence hit even harder. Maybe dogs understand purpose better than people do. Jack leaned back slowly. The similarities between Walter and himself no longer felt accidental. Two veterans, two military dogs, two men isolated from the world after war, and now somehow connected across nearly a decade through one rusted trawler. The harbor radio crackled suddenly near the dashboard. Static first, then voices. Jack ignored it until one name caught his attention. Holloway. He turned up the volume carefully. County inspection scheduled tomorrow. Another burst of static swallowed the rest. Shadow lifted his head immediately. Jack frowned. Inspection. Too fast. Too convenient. Half an hour later, Ray Holloway himself walked onto the dock, carrying paperwork beneath one arm. The harbor commissioner looked calm again. Too calm. Jack stepped outside before Ray reached the boat. Shadow positioned himself beside him instantly. Ray stopped several feet away. "I'm here officially this time," he said lightly. Jack took the paperwork without answering. Harbor safety notice. Violations. Unsafe electrical systems, fire hazards, compromised fuel lines, unregistered occupancy. Final line. Failure to comply may result in vessel seizure and condemnation. Jack read it once, then looked up slowly. "You move fast." Ray smiled thinly. "Harbor safety matters." "Funny timing." Ray's eyes drifted toward Shadow's bandaged leg. "Heard your dog got hurt." Jack's entire posture hardened slightly. Ray noticed. "Shame," he added quietly. "Old dogs don't heal like they used to." For one dangerous second, the dock went completely silent. Even gulls seemed distant. Jack stepped closer. "Did you send those men onto my boat?" Ray held his gaze calmly. "You're a homeless veteran living illegally aboard condemned harbor property. Be careful about accusations." His smile faded. "You don't have many people here who'd choose your version of events over mine." Jack looked down at the violation notice again, then folded it slowly. "How much?" Ray blinked once. "What?" "How much money are you offering me to leave?" The harbor commissioner stared at him several seconds before answering. 20,000. The number hung between them. Enough for a vehicle and apartment, food, disappearing somewhere warm enough to escape. Ray reached into his coat and removed a business envelope. "Cash." Jack looked at it, then at the harbor around them. Fishermen repairing nets, broken docks, old boats, people surviving quietly. Walter Grady's journals, Shadow's blood on the cabin floor from protecting evidence that wasn't even theirs. $20,000 suddenly felt unbearably heavy. Ray extended the envelope slightly. "You leave tonight. Nobody bothers you again." Jack said nothing. Ray stepped closer. "You think this town will thank you for digging around old wounds?" His voice lowered. "People here survive because certain truths stay buried." Shadow growled softly. Ray looked at the dog, then back at Jack. "Take the money." Jack stared at the envelope one final second, then walked away without touching it. Ray's voice followed him. "You don't know what you're carrying yet." Jack stopped at the cabin door, but didn't turn around. "Neither do you." That evening, the harbor fell quiet beneath another incoming storm. Wind pushed low clouds across the Pacific, while rain began tapping softly against the iron Gull again. Inside the cabin, Jack sat beside the stove, turning the offer over in his head. $20,000. A clean escape. No more danger. No more war. He could leave tonight. Disappear again. That's what he'd done ever since returning from Afghanistan anyway. Town to town. Job to job. Never staying long enough for attachment. Because attachment became loss eventually. Always. Shadow slowly limped across the cabin and disappeared below deck. Jack followed a minute later. The old shepherd had curled himself beside the hidden compartment, beside Walter's journals, guarding them. Jack leaned against the engine housing, staring down at him. "You really think this matters?" Shadow looked up quietly. The dog's injured paw rested directly beside Walter's photograph of Boone. Something inside Jack cracked slightly then. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough. Because suddenly he realized Walter Grady spent his whole life protecting people who never even knew he existed. No medals, no recognition, no applause, just quiet sacrifice. Exactly what Jack once believed soldiers were supposed to be. Before the war hollowed everything out. He sat beside Shadow on the cold steel floor. For a long time, neither moved. Rain drummed softly overhead. Finally, Jack spoke into the darkness. "I don't know how to live outside survival anymore." Shadow pressed against him silently, and for the first time since arriving in Blackwater Cove, Jack admitted something terrifying to himself. He didn't want to leave. The realization sat heavy inside him long after midnight, while rain slid down the wheelhouse windows in silver streaks. For years, survival had been simple. Never stay. Never trust comfort. Never build anything you couldn't abandon overnight. That was how broken men stayed alive. But Blackwater Cove was changing something inside him. Or maybe Walter Grady was. Shadow slept beside the hidden compartment below deck, guarding the journals like sacred things. The old shepherd's breathing was slow and uneven from exhaustion, but peaceful. Jack sat nearby on the cold steel floor holding Walter's photograph of Boone. 2 old military dogs, 2 veterans trying to outrun ghosts, and somehow 1 unfinished mission stretching across nearly a decade. By morning, the storm had passed. The harbor emerged beneath pale winter sunlight and drifting fog. Fishing boats groaned against their moorings while gulls circled overhead, crying into the cold wind rolling off the Pacific. Jack barely slept. He brewed coffee in silence while studying one of Walter's later journals again. One entry repeated itself across several pages. "Helen doesn't understand why I keep digging. Maybe that's good. Maybe somebody deserves peace around here." Helen, Walter's sister. Martha had mentioned her once briefly. "Lives out near the cliffs," she'd said. "Keeps mostly to herself." Jack closed the journal slowly. If anyone knew the full story behind Walter's disappearance, it would be her. Shadow lifted his head immediately when Jack grabbed his coat. "Yeah," Jack murmured. "You're coming." The drive out of Blackwater Cove followed a narrow coastal road, winding past forests of dark pine and steep cliffs overlooking crashing gray ocean below. Jack borrowed Martha's old pickup truck after she insisted. "Brakes stick a little," she warned. "Fits right in with the rest of my life." She almost smiled at that. The farther Jack drove from town, the quieter the world became. Ocean, trees, wind, no harbor noise, no sirens, no people watching him from windows. Shadow sat upright beside him despite the injured shoulder, ears alert as always. The road finally ended near a small, weathered house perched above rocky coastline cliffs, paint peeling, wind chimes rusted by salt air, a single porch light still hanging despite daylight. Helen Grady answered the door before Jack knocked. She looked somewhere in her late 60s with sharp gray eyes and silver hair tied back tightly. Not fragile. Tired, but not fragile. The moment she saw Shadow, something changed in her expression. Then she noticed the journal under Jack's arm. All color drained from her face. "You found the boat?" Not a question. Jack nodded once. "And you found what Walter hid?" The wind howled softly through the trees around the house. Helen stepped aside slowly. "Come inside." The house smelled faintly of cedar wood and old coffee. Photographs lined nearly every wall. Walter younger beside enormous salmon catches. Walter standing aboard the Iron Gull decades earlier, smiling beside Boone. Walter in navy whites, long before age hardened his face. Helen noticed Jack staring. "He hated cameras," she said quietly. "Those are the only photos I have." Jack sat carefully at the kitchen table while Shadow settled beside the wood stove. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Helen looked directly at the journal in Jack's hands. "How much did you read?" "Enough," she nodded slowly. "I warned him this would happen." Jack frowned. "You knew he was investigating Ray Holloway?" "I knew Walter believed people were poisoning the harbor." Helen folded her hands tightly together. "And I knew he became obsessed with proving it." Jack placed the journal gently onto the table. He documented everything. A bitter smile crossed her face. That sounds like Walter. Jack studied her carefully. You think he was killed? Helen's eyes moved toward the ocean outside the kitchen window. I think my brother was hunted. Silence settled heavily between them. Only the wind outside. Only the stove crackling softly. Finally, Helen stood and walked toward an old cabinet near the hallway. She returned holding another photograph. Walter standing beside Ray Holloway 20 years earlier. Both younger, laughing, friends. Jack stared at it. They were close once, Helen said quietly. Ray practically lived aboard the Iron Gull during his 20s. What changed? Money. She sat slowly again. And fear. Helen explained how Blackwater Cove began declining years earlier when fishing industries collapsed along sections of the Oregon coast. Federal grants arrived promising environmental restoration and harbor modernization. Ray Holloway became the town hero almost overnight. He saved the harbor financially, Helen said. At first. Jack already knew the rest. People who saved communities sometimes learned how easy it became to control them afterward. Helen's face tightened. Walter started noticing things missing from official reports. Repairs never completed, cleanup crews never arriving, fishing waters getting sicker. She looked down at her hands. Then people started following him. Jack leaned forward slightly. You saw them? One night, Walter came here bleeding from his forehead after somebody ran him off the road. Her voice shook for the first time. He still refused to stop. Shadow lifted his head slightly from beside the stove. Helen looked at the old shepherd quietly. Boone used to sit exactly like that. Jack glanced toward Shadow. The dog's cloudy brown eyes remained fixed on Helen now, almost gentle. Helen swallowed hard. Walter believed military dogs understood loyalty better than humans ever could. Jack said nothing, because part of him believed it too. Helen reached beneath the table slowly and pulled out a small locked tin box. I wasn't supposed to have this. She unlocked it carefully. Inside sat legal documents, trust records, bank receipts, property filings. Jack's pulse slowed immediately. Helen slid one document across the table. The Iron Gull Maritime Trust. Walter Grady had established a legal trust nearly 10 years earlier, connected directly to ownership of the trawler itself. Jack read quickly. Beneficiary designation transfers to lawful vessel owner. Helen nodded. Walter knew he might disappear. Her voice lowered. So he built a way for the truth to survive him. Jack looked up sharply. How much money? I don't know exactly anymore. Helen's eyes drifted toward the ocean again. But Walter invested for years, quietly, every spare dollar. Jack thought about the hidden generosity in the journals, the bills paid anonymously, the sacrifices. Walter wasn't just preserving evidence. He was preserving the town itself. A floorboard creaked suddenly outside the house. Shadow was on his feet instantly, growling. Jack moved automatically toward the front window. Nothing visible, only trees bending in the coastal wind. But tracks marked the muddy driveway, fresh tire tracks. A vehicle had been there recently. Helen saw them too. Her face paled. He found out you came here. Jack's instincts sharpened instantly. Who? Ray! Shadow barked sharply toward the rear of the house. Then came the sound. Glass shattering. Helen gasped. Jack moved instantly. Two men burst through the back door wearing dark rain jackets and gloves. Not thieves. Searching. One headed directly toward the kitchen table and the trust documents. Shadow intercepted him like a missile. The old shepherd slammed into the man's chest hard enough to send both crashing into cabinets. The second intruder grabbed Helen roughly by the arm. Jack crossed the room before the man could react. Years of combat training exploded awake again. One strike. Fast. Precise. The intruder hit the floor unconscious beside the stove. The first man shoved Shadow away violently and reached for the document box. Jack grabbed him by the collar and drove him through the broken back doorway into the mud outside. The man scrambled backward instantly. Panicked now. "Go!" he shouted toward his partner. Both men ran toward a black pickup truck hidden among the trees. Shadow tried following, then suddenly stumbled. Jack froze. Blood darkened the fur along the shepherd's side again. The old wound had reopened during the struggle. "Shadow!" The truck roared away down the coastal road, spraying mud and gravel behind it. Helen stood shaking near the stove. Jack dropped beside Shadow immediately. The dog was breathing hard but conscious, still trying to stand, still trying to protect. "Easy," Jack whispered. Helen pressed trembling fingers against her mouth, watching the old shepherd. "They came for Walter's papers." Jack looked toward the scattered trust documents across the floor. Now there was no doubt left. Ray Holloway knew exactly what Walter hid, and he was getting desperate enough to use force openly. Shadow rested his head weakly against Jack's leg. The old dog's eyes never left the broken doorway, still guarding, still ready. And for the first time since the war ended, Jack felt something stronger than fear. He felt responsible. The realization settled into him while he carried Shadow carefully back toward Martha's truck beneath cold coastal wind. Helen Grady walked beside them, clutching Walter's trust documents tightly against her chest. The old shepherd trembled slightly from pain, but never stopped watching the tree line behind them, still guarding, still searching for threats. Jack laid Shadow gently across the truck's back seat. Blood stained the old blanket beneath him. Helen touched Jack's arm quietly. "You should take him to a vet." Jack nodded once. "There's one 20 miles north in Baycrest," Helen said. "Walter used to take Boone there." The mention of Boone hit harder now, because Shadow had nearly died, protecting Walter's evidence exactly the way Boone once protected Walter himself. As Jack drove north along the coastal highway, fog rolled across the cliffs below like smoke rising from the Pacific. Shadow rested his muzzle against Jack's arm the entire drive. Jack kept one hand on the wheel and the other on the old dog's neck, grounding himself, staying present. The veterinary clinic sat beside a small grocery store overlooking the bay. Simple white building. Wind chimes hanging near the porch. A woman in green scrubs met them at the door before Jack even reached it. "Bring him in." Dr. Claire Bennett moved with calm, practiced confidence. Mid-40s, kind eyes. The sort of person who spent her life helping things survive. Shadow allowed her examination quietly, despite the pain. "He reopened an older wound," she said gently, while cleaning the injury. "But he's tougher than he looks." Jack almost smiled. "You don't know the half of it." Claire glanced toward the military harness folded beside Shadow on the table. "Working dog?" "Retired Navy K-9. Something in her expression softened immediately. "My brother handled dogs overseas." Jack nodded faintly. No further explanation needed. People connected to military service recognized certain kinds of exhaustion without words. Claire finished stitching the wound carefully, while Shadow remained perfectly still beneath her hands. "He'll recover," she said finally. "But he needs rest." Jack looked down at the shepherd. "Yeah," he murmured quietly. "We both do." Helen waited outside during the treatment, staring out across the gray ocean. When Jack emerged carrying Shadow carefully beside him, she handed him a folded paper. "What's this?" "Walter's storage key." Jack frowned. He rented a safety locker in Baycrest 2 months before he vanished. Helen looked toward the harbor road behind them. "I always thought he hid backup records there." Jack studied the small brass key. Another layer, another safeguard. Walter Grady planned for everything. The storage facility sat near the industrial docks on Baycrest's southern edge. Rows of rusted metal lockers stretched through dim concrete corridors smelling faintly of mildew and seawater. Unit 214. Jack unlocked it slowly. Inside sat old filing boxes, cassette recordings, photo negatives, shipping manifests, federal environmental reports. And one final item, a tape recorder. Jack pressed play carefully. Static crackled first. Then Walter Grady's voice filled the small locker room. Older, rough, tired. If somebody finds this, things have gone bad. Jack felt the hairs rise along his arms instantly. Walter continued. The dumping isn't random anymore. They're using old wartime disposal zones north of Devil's Reef. Chemicals, solvents, waste drums. The cleanup money keeps disappearing while the fishing waters keep dying. Papers rustled faintly on the tape. Then Walter's voice lowered. Ray knows I copied the shipping records. He offered me money first. Then threats. Now strangers follow Boone and me every night through the harbor. Helen closed her eyes, hearing her brother's voice again after 9 years. Jack listened silently. If I disappear, Blackwater Cove deserves the truth. Not revenge. Truth. The tape clicked softly. Then one final sentence. Steel does not forget. Silence followed. Even the ocean outside seemed quieter afterward. Jack slowly looked around the locker. Walter hadn't just hidden evidence. He built layers of protection like a military operation. Compartment, trust, backup storage, recordings. The old fisherman understood exactly how dangerous the truth had become. Helen wiped tears quietly from her face. He knew, she whispered. He knew they'd come for him. Jack nodded, and he kept going anyway. By late afternoon, they returned to Blackwater Cove. News traveled fast in small towns. People stared openly now when Jack drove through the harbor district. Whispers followed him. The homeless veteran. The dog. Walter Grady's boat. Something was changing beneath the surface of Blackwater Cove. Fear was cracking. Martha met them at the diner parking lot immediately. How bad? Shadow's okay. Relief flooded her face instantly. Then Jack handed her one of Walter's journals. Read this. Martha sat slowly inside the empty diner booth, while evening rain tapped softly against the windows. Jack watched her expression shift page by page. Confusion, shock, then grief. Her hand trembled slightly, reading one specific entry. December 18th paid Martha Quinn's mortgage this month after Daniel died. She must never know. Pride is sometimes the only thing grief leaves people. Martha covered her mouth. Oh my God. Jack stayed quiet. Tears slid down her face silently, while the diner lights reflected against the wet harbor outside. All these years, she whispered, I thought the bank made an error. Jack nodded slowly. He saved half this town quietly. Martha looked up at him. Why would somebody like Walter hide it? Jack thought about that carefully. Maybe because he understood people survive better with dignity. That answer came from somewhere deeper than he expected. Martha noticed. You understand him now. Jack looked toward Shadow, sleeping near the diner heater. Yeah, he admitted softly. I think I do. That night, Jack made his decision. No more hiding. No more surviving quietly while other people carried the cost. He gathered Walter's journals, the storage recordings, shipping manifests, trust records, photographs, then drove directly to the county administration office 30 miles inland. The building stayed open late during storm season. A tired county investigator named Susan Vale listened carefully while Jack spread evidence across her desk, one piece at a time. At first, she looked skeptical. Then she started reading. and her expression changed. "This is substantial." "There's more," Jack said. He handed her the cassette recordings. Susan looked up sharply. "You're accusing harbor officials of environmental crimes, fraud, and intimidation." "No," Jack answered quietly. "Walter Grady is." The investigator studied him several seconds. "You understand what happens if this goes public?" Jack thought about Ray Holloway, about Shadow bleeding on the cabin floor, about Walter disappearing alone into the Pacific fog. "Yeah," he said, "I do." Before leaving, Jack made one final stop. The Blackwater Register newspaper office sat above an old pharmacy downtown. Only one reporter remained inside near closing time. Eli Garner. Young, thin, coffee stains on his sleeves, the kind of journalist still idealistic enough to care. Jack dropped Walter's photographs onto the desk. Dead fish washing ashore, night cargo transfers, hidden dumping coordinates. Eli stared at them speechlessly. "Where did you get these?" "From a dead fisherman everybody forgot." 3 days later, the story exploded across the Oregon coast. Front page headline: Blackwater Harbor under investigation, missing fishermen's hidden records reveal decades of corruption. The article spread fast, faster than Ray Holloway could contain, and something extraordinary happened afterward. The town started talking. An old dock worker admitted anonymous rent payments saved his family during the recession. A widow remembered medical bills mysteriously disappearing after her husband drowned offshore. Fishermen realized someone quietly covered fuel costs during brutal winters. Walter Grady. Always Walter Grady. The invisible man holding Blackwater Cove together without anybody noticing. People arrived at Martha's Diner carrying stories, memories, grief. The atmosphere inside the harbor changed completely. No longer silence. Now mourning. Now anger. Now shame. Jack sat quietly in a diner booth watching it unfold while Shadow rested beneath the table. Martha approached carrying coffee. "You did this." Jack shook his head slowly. "No." He looked toward Walter's photograph hanging behind the counter, now beside the cash register. "He did." Outside, county investigators arrived at the harbor office before sunrise. Sheriff vehicles blocked entrances. Federal environmental agents followed shortly afterward, and standing inside the harbor office window, Ray Holloway looked trapped for the very first time in his life. Rain streaked down the glass behind him, while federal investigators carried boxes of records through the harbor office doors one after another. Dock workers stopped pretending not to watch anymore. Fishermen gathered in silence along the marina railings. Blackwater Cove had finally turned its eyes toward the truth. And the truth was ugly. Jack stood near the fuel dock beside Shadow, watching the scene unfold beneath cold gray skies. The old shepherd leaned lightly against his leg, stitched shoulder healing slowly, but still stiff. People approached them now, not with suspicion, with curiosity, respect. An elderly fisherman removed his cap as he passed. "Walter would have liked you." Jack didn't know how to answer that, because part of him still felt like a drifter who accidentally stepped into someone else's unfinished war. Martha walked up carrying 2 coffees. "You haven't slept." "Neither has the town." That was true. Everywhere Jack looked, conversations moved through the harbor like spreading fire. Stories, memories, realizations. A mechanic named Luis Ortega admitted Walter once paid for his daughter's surgery after an accident at sea. A bait shop owner remembered mysterious heating oil deliveries every winter after business slowed. Even Sheriff Coulter quietly confessed Walter covered funeral expenses for his younger brother years ago. Invisible acts, invisible sacrifices. One quiet man stitching an entire community together while nobody noticed. Shadow watched the harbor calmly beside Jack. People stopped to pet him now. Children approached carefully. Old fisherman scratched behind his ears gently, like honoring another veteran. The dog accepted it all with tired dignity. Jack glanced toward the iron gull resting against the dock. Fresh federal seals now marked the harbor office doors. Ray Holloway's empire was collapsing. Publicly, which made him dangerous. That realization sat heavily inside Jack all afternoon. By sunset, storm clouds gathered again over the Pacific. Wind pushed through the harbor harder than before, rattling rigging lines against metal masts across the marina. Sheriff Coulter found Jack near the trawler. "We arrested 2 men this morning tied to the break-in at Helen's place." Jack looked up sharply. "They talk?" "Enough." The sheriff rubbed tired eyes. Ray paid them cash to recover Walter's records. Jack nodded slowly. No surprise anymore. Coulter lowered his voice. "We're close to charging him officially." He glanced around the harbor carefully. "But cornered men do stupid things." Jack thought about that after the sheriff left, because he understood cornered men. He'd been one himself for years. That night the storm finally arrived. Hard. Rain slammed the harbor sideways, while wind screamed through the marina like something alive. Most boats remained dark, most people stayed home, but lights still glowed inside the iron gull. Jack sat at the cabin table reviewing trust documents, while Shadow slept near the stove wrapped in blankets Martha had brought earlier. The old trawler rocked heavily against her moorings. Outside, waves crashed violently against the seawall. Thunder rolled over the Pacific. And somewhere around midnight, Shadow's head lifted suddenly. The old shepherd growled. Jack froze instantly. Not again. He moved quietly toward the wheelhouse windows. Nothing visible at first. Only rain. Only darkness. Then, movement near the stern. A shadow slipping across the dock. Jack reached for the flashlight. Another shape appeared. Then another. 3 men, moving fast toward the trawler. Jack's instincts ignited immediately. "Shadow!" The shepherd struggled upright despite the injury. Then came the smell. Gasoline. Jack's stomach dropped. "Move!" The first Molotov crashed against the stern deck an instant later. Glass exploded. Flames erupted violently across old wood and rope. Heat flooded the cabin immediately. Another bottle shattered against the wheelhouse wall. Fire climbed upward in orange waves. Smoke poured through the broken window instantly. Shadow barked furiously. Jack grabbed Walter's journals from the table. Then another explosion rocked the deck. Flames spread toward the engine compartment, frighteningly fast. Outside, footsteps pounded away into the storm. The attackers were already running. Jack coughed hard as black smoke filled the cabin. The old trawler groaned around him. Wood cracking, paint blistering, fire racing along fuel-stained surfaces. "Shadow!" The dog staggered toward the hidden compartment instead of the exit. Jack grabbed for him, but Shadow pulled away, growling, determined. Then Jack realized why. The military case. Walter's evidence, still hidden below deck. "No!" Another burst of flame exploded through the rear cabin. Heat slammed into Jack's face hard enough to force him backward. Smoke swallowed the room instantly. The old shepherd disappeared below deck. Jack dove after him without thinking. The lower compartment had become an oven of smoke and sparks. Flames licked through cracks overhead while boiling black smoke rolled downward. Jack could barely breathe. Then he saw Shadow. The old dog stood beside the hidden compartment, dragging the waterproof military case by its handle despite the injured shoulder, still protecting it, still refusing to abandon the mission. "Come on!" Jack grabbed the case with one hand and Shadow with the other. The ceiling groaned overhead. Burning debris crashed into the engine room behind them. The iron gull screamed like a living thing. They barely reached the ladder before part of the cabin roof collapsed in flames behind them. Jack shoved Shadow upward first, then climbed after him into chaos. The deck had become an inferno. Wind drove flames across the trawler in violent bursts, while rain hissed uselessly against burning fuel. People were shouting now across the harbor. Sirens wailed in the distance. Martha ran down the docks, screaming Jack's name. Dock workers grabbed hoses from nearby boats. Sheriff Coulter shouted orders through the storm, but all Jack could focus on was Shadow collapsing beside the gangplank, still gripping the military case handle between his teeth. The dog had dragged Walter's truth through fire itself. Jack dropped beside him instantly. "Shadow!" The shepherd's breathing came shallow and ragged. Smoke inhalation. Exhaustion. Jack lifted him carefully into his arms and stumbled off the burning trawler into freezing rain. The military case fell beside them onto the dock. Still intact. Still sealed. Still protected. The harbor erupted around them. Fire crews arrived, spraying water toward the Iron Gull, while flames climbed through the wheelhouse windows into the storm-black sky. People gathered everywhere now, watching, shouting, crying, and then something extraordinary happened. Martha stepped forward first, then Sheriff Coulter, then fishermen, dock workers, families. One by one, the people of Blackwater Cove formed a line, passing buckets, dragging hoses, helping fight for Walter Grady's boat. Not because of the trawler, because of what it represented. Jack knelt beside Shadow in the rain, while Claire Bennett pressed an oxygen mask gently over the dog's muzzle. "He's breathing," she said urgently. "Stay with me, buddy." Jack's hands shook slightly against the shepherd's wet fur. Not from fear, from helplessness. The same feeling he remembered from losing men overseas. The same terror of watching something loyal suffer because of a mission. Shadow's eyes finally opened weakly. He looked toward the military case lying safely nearby, still guarding it. Even now. Jack swallowed hard. "You stubborn old soldier!" Thunder cracked overhead, and across the harbor, standing beneath flashing emergency lights, Ray Holloway watched the Iron Gull burn while the entire town turned slowly against him. Rain hammered the marina in silver sheets while flames consumed the wheelhouse windows of the old trawler. The fire reflected across the harbor water, like blood spreading through black glass. Nobody looked at Ray the same way anymore. Not after seeing Shadow drag Walter Grady's evidence from the flames. Not after watching Jack carry the injured old dog through smoke while the harbor commissioner stood dry beneath his umbrella saying nothing. People noticed things once fear cracked open. Fishermen stopped speaking when Ray walked past. Dock workers turned away from him openly. Even the sheriff deputies avoided meeting his eyes. Blackwater Cove had chosen a side now, and Ray knew it. Claire Bennett worked over Shadow inside the back of the emergency veterinary van parked near the docks. Oxygen mask, warm blankets, careful hands. Jack sat beside the old shepherd, refusing to leave him. The dog's breathing remained shallow but steady. "He inhaled a lot of smoke," Claire said quietly. "But he's fighting." Jack rested one hand against Shadow's neck. The old dog opened his eyes weakly, still alert, still trying to watch the harbor through the open van doors. Claire smiled faintly. "He's worried about you." Jack almost laughed at that. Story of his life. Outside, firefighters finally began controlling the blaze aboard the Iron Gull. The stern was destroyed. Sections of the cabin roof had collapsed inward. Smoke rolled upward into storm clouds drifting over the Pacific. But somehow, the hull remained intact. Steel does not forget. Walter's words echoed inside Jack's head, watching the battered trawler survive fire exactly the way it survived storms. Sheriff Coulter climbed into the van near dawn. His face looked exhausted, older than before. "We arrested Ray Holloway an hour ago." Jack looked up slowly. "For arson?" For enough things to bury him. The sheriff handed Jack a folded paper. Federal environmental charges, fraud, bribery, conspiracy. His eyes darkened slightly. And attempted destruction of evidence. Jack glanced toward the harbor office across the marina. Ray's black SUV was gone now. Only flashing federal vehicles remained. Coulter lowered his voice. He confessed to paying the men who attacked Helen's place. Jack nodded once, not surprised. Did he confess about Walter? The sheriff hesitated. Not fully. That answer stayed with Jack long after dawn broke across Blackwater Cove. The storm finally passed by morning. Cold, pale sunlight spilled across the damaged harbor while smoke still drifted from the iron Gull. People gathered quietly along the docks, staring at the burned trawler. Not with pity, with grief. Martha arrived carrying coffee and sandwiches for firefighters who had worked through the night. She stopped beside Jack near the veterinary van. How's Shadow? He's alive. That dog's tougher than the rest of us combined. Jack looked toward the trawler. He saved everything. Martha followed his gaze. No, she said softly. He saved the truth. By afternoon, news crews arrived from Portland. Cameras lined the harbor. Reporters interviewed fishermen beneath gray skies, while federal agents carried evidence boxes from the harbor office into waiting vehicles. Blackwater Cove suddenly mattered to the outside world. Jack hated the attention immediately. Too many people, too many questions, too many eyes. The old instincts returned fast. Find exits, watch hands, track movement. He slipped away from the crowd eventually and walked alone toward the county jail 3 towns inland. He wasn't entirely sure why until he arrived. Maybe because unfinished things haunted him. Maybe because Walter deserved answers. Or maybe because Jack Mercer had spent too many years running from hard conversations. The jail smelled faintly of disinfectant and old coffee. Sheriff Coulter met him outside the holding area. You sure about this? No. The sheriff nodded. That's probably the honest answer. Ray Holloway sat alone behind thick, reinforced glass, wearing county jail clothes that suddenly made him look smaller somehow. Older, too. Fear and exhaustion had hollowed him out overnight. He looked up slowly when Jack entered the room. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Ray gave a tired, bitter laugh. You look exactly like Walter used to. Jack remained standing. I'm not him. No. Ray stared down at his cuffed hands. Walter still believed people could be saved. Silence settled heavily between them. Jack finally sat across from him. Tell me what happened. Ray closed his eyes briefly. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. The harbor was dying, he said quietly. Nobody cared about Blackwater Cove anymore. Federal money came in. More than anybody in town had ever seen. He swallowed hard. At first, I only moved small amounts. Jack said nothing. One repair contract, then another. Ray's voice shook slightly now. I told myself I'd replace it later. But greed never stayed small. It spread. Contracts, cleanup funds, offshore dumping payments from shipping companies wanting cheap disposal routes. Ray built an empire slowly, while convincing himself he was still protecting the town. Then Walter Grady noticed. He came to my office carrying ledgers and photographs. Ray stared through the glass somewhere far away now. He looked disappointed more than angry. A weak laugh escaped him. That was worse somehow. Jack leaned forward slightly. You threatened him. Ray nodded slowly. At first. Then came surveillance. Men following Walter. Sabotage. Fear. Because every day Walter kept digging deeper. Finally, Jack asked the question that had followed them through the entire harbor story. What happened the night Walter disappeared? Ray's face collapsed inward slightly. Storm memories moved behind his eyes. He planned to expose everything publicly. Ray's voice dropped nearly to a whisper. I sent men to scare him before he reached the county office. Jack's jaw tightened. They chased him offshore? Ray nodded once. Walter tried outrunning them through the storm near Devil's Reef. His eyes filled slowly with regret. The weather turned too fast. Boone fell overboard first. Jack felt something cold move through his chest. Walter turned back for the dog. Of course he did. The room went silent, because both men already knew exactly why. Ray rubbed shaking hands together. The last radio transmission we intercepted, he swallowed hard. Walter was still calling for Boone. Jack stared at him. And you let him disappear. I told myself it wasn't murder. Ray finally looked directly at him. But fear doesn't care what names you use afterward. Jack stood slowly. Every part of him wanted to hate the man sitting behind the glass. But another part recognized something deeply uncomfortable. Ray Holloway wasn't born evil. He became weak slowly, one compromise at a time, one selfish decision at a time. That was somehow worse. Before leaving, Jack paused at the door. Walter forgave people too easily. Ray looked down. I know. Jack walked out into cold afternoon sunlight feeling strangely hollow. Not victorious. Not relieved. Just tired. The drive back toward Blackwater Cove followed empty coastal highways beneath clearing skies. Ocean cliffs stretched endlessly beside him, while old memories rose uninvited again. Afghanistan. Smoke. Teammates screaming over broken radios. Mason bleeding beside him beneath collapsing concrete. Jack gripping his hand while helicopters arrived too late. Survivor's guilt never disappeared. It just waited quietly, between moments. That evening he returned to the harbor. The iron Gull still floated despite the fire damage. Scarred, blackened, but alive. People had gathered near the docks carrying tools already. Fishermen, mechanics, dock workers. Nobody asked permission. They simply started helping, replacing boards, removing burned debris, saving Walter's boat. Martha handed Jack a cup of coffee while watching the work continue beneath orange sunset light. Looks like the town finally remembered how to stand together. Jack stared at the harbor silently. Shadow emerged slowly from the veterinary van wrapped in blankets. Weak, but walking. The entire dock applauded softly when they saw him. The old shepherd looked confused by the attention. Jack knelt carefully beside him. You hear that, buddy? Shadow leaned tiredly against him. For the first time in years, Jack talked openly, not to reporters, not to investigators, to Martha, to Sheriff Coulter, to people who simply listened, about the war, about losing men overseas, about waking up every night convinced he still smelled smoke and blood. No dramatic speeches, just truth. Quiet and painful. The kind Walter Grady would have respected. Night settled slowly across Blackwater Cove afterward. The harbor lights reflected across calm water once more, and for the first time since Jack Mercer returned from war, he no longer felt completely alone inside his own memories. Winter passed slowly along the Oregon coast. Storms came and went across Blackwater Cove, but the harbor no longer felt abandoned beneath them. Things were changing. Quietly. Steadily. Like a town waking up after years of holding its breath. 3 months after the fire, the Iron Gull still floated at Slip 14. Scarred. Blackened in places. But alive. Jack rebuilt her one piece at a time. Every morning before sunrise, he walked the docks carrying coffee in one hand and a toolbox in the other, while Shadow limped faithfully beside him. The old shepherd moved slower now. Smoke damage and age had stolen some of his strength, but never his spirit, never his watchfulness. The town greeted them differently these days. Fishermen waved from fuel docks. Children ran toward Shadow after school carrying scraps of bacon from Martha's diner. Even the harbor itself seemed warmer somehow, less haunted. Jack repaired the trawler exactly the way he repaired himself, quietly, patiently, one damaged section at a time. He replaced burned wiring, rebuilt sections of the wheelhouse roof, sanded smoke stains from the cabin walls until fresh wood emerged beneath. The engine took longest. Weeks of rebuilding injectors, replacing cracked hoses, cleaning soot from fuel lines. Most men would have scrapped the boat. But Jack understood damaged things deserved a chance to return home too. The recovered trust money changed Blackwater Cove faster than anyone expected. Federal investigators uncovered millions missing from environmental restoration grants tied to Ray Holloway's operation. Part of the recovered funds went directly back into the harbor through Walter Grady's trust. Broken seawalls were repaired, fuel docks reopened, fishing permits returned. For the first time in years, younger families stopped leaving town. Martha expanded the diner kitchen. Sheriff Coulter hired 2 new deputies. Even the old bait shop repainted its windows. Walter Grady had spent 30 years quietly saving people one family at a time. Now his final act was saving the entire harbor. Helen Grady visited the Iron Gull nearly every evening. Sometimes she brought coffee, sometimes photographs. Sometimes she simply sat quietly inside the restored wheelhouse watching gulls circle over the Pacific. One evening, she handed Jack a folded letter she had found hidden inside Walter's old coat. He wrote this after Boone died. Jack opened it carefully. The handwriting looked older than the journals, more tired. Boone taught me something I wish people understood. Loyalty is not obedience. It is love surviving fear. Jack read the sentence twice, then quietly folded the letter again. He really understood dogs. Helen smiled faintly. No. Her eyes drifted toward Shadow, sleeping beside the stove. I think he understood lonely things. That stayed with Jack a long time. By February, the Iron Gull wore fresh navy blue paint across her hull, the same color Walter kept her during her best years, according to old photographs. The harbor gathered silently the day Jack restarted the rebuilt engine for the first time. Dock workers, fishermen, Martha, Helen, Sheriff Coulter, Claire Bennett. People stood along the marina railings holding coffee cups beneath cold morning fog. Jack turned the ignition carefully. At first, nothing happened. Then, the old diesel coughed once, twice, and finally roared alive. Deep, steady, powerful. The sound echoed across Blackwater Cove like a heartbeat returning after years of silence. The harbor erupted into applause. Jack sat frozen at the controls for several seconds while engine vibrations rolled through the deck beneath him. Alive again. The Iron Gull was alive again. Shadow barked once proudly from beside the wheelhouse door. Martha wiped tears from her eyes openly. Helen stared at the boat, as if seeing her brother one final time. Jack shut the engine down slowly afterward and stepped onto the deck. The whole harbor smelled like salt air, diesel fuel, rain, and fresh paint. Home. That word no longer scared him. Weeks later, Sheriff Coulter visited the trawler carrying final court documents. Ray Holloway had officially pleaded guilty to fraud, environmental crimes, conspiracy, intimidation, destruction of evidence. His testimony helped federal investigators dismantle the offshore dumping operation completely. Several shipping companies faced criminal charges afterward, but none of that mattered most to Blackwater Cove. What mattered was Walter Grady's name finally returned to the harbor where it belonged. The town council renamed the marina seawall Grady Point. A bronze plaque appeared beside the docks shortly afterward. Walter Grady, fisherman, veteran, guardian of Blackwater Cove. People left flowers there sometimes. Fishing hooks, coins, handwritten notes, quiet gratitude for a man many never truly saw while he lived. Jack visited the plaque only once, at sunrise, alone except for shadow. He stood silently staring at Walter's name carved into bronze while waves rolled gently against the seawall beneath morning fog. "You were stubborn as hell," Jack murmured quietly. Shadow sat beside him watching the ocean. The old dog's muzzle had turned almost entirely gray now, but his eyes remained sharp, steady, present. Jack reached down and scratched behind his ears. "We made it, buddy." By spring, Dale Morrison officially hired Jack full-time at the marine repair shop near the commercial docks. "You rebuild engines like a man arguing with God," Dale told him once. Jack considered that. Maybe he was. The work helped. Routine helped. Purpose helped most of all. For the first time since Afghanistan, Jack woke each morning knowing exactly where he belonged. Not surviving. Living. There was a difference. One cold April morning, Helen arrived at the Iron Gull carrying Walter's old compass. Brass. Weathered. Still functional. He'd want this in the wheelhouse. Jack accepted it carefully. Together they mounted the compass beside Walter's framed photograph overlooking the restored controls. Walter, at 30 years old, standing proudly aboard the trawler. Boone beside him, watching over the harbor again. That afternoon, the Pacific lay calm beneath pale sunlight. Perfect water. Perfect tide. Jack finally untied the Iron Gull from slip 14. The entire harbor gathered quietly to watch. Fishing boats sounded horns one by one as the trawler eased slowly from the marina. Martha stood near the diner porch holding coffee against her chest. Sheriff Coulter removed his cap respectfully. Claire waved from the fuel dock. Helen stood closest to the seawall with tears shining openly in her eyes. Jack guided the trawler carefully through the harbor channel, while Shadow stood at the bow facing open ocean. Wind lifted the old shepherd's fur gently. The Pacific stretched endlessly ahead beneath silver morning fog. The same ocean, the same route Walter Grady once sailed. But this time the boat carried something different. Not secrets, not fear, hope. As Blackwater Cove disappeared slowly behind them, Jack glanced toward Walter's photograph mounted beside the compass. Then quietly, almost like reporting to an old commanding officer, he said, "Mission complete, old man." The engine hummed steadily beneath his feet. Shadow remained at the bow watching the horizon. And somewhere beyond the morning fog, the tide finally carried them home. If you believe good people still matter in this world, drop a yes in the comments. And if you've ever had to rebuild your life from nothing, tell us where you're watching from tonight. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us for more stories about justice, loyalty, and the kind of people who never quit when life gets rough.